Hello and welcome to February's CRC Café. I'm going to talk to you today about URC best practices. Now, we all know that propagation, mother stock, this is all the beginning of everything. And having happy and healthy plants will certainly prove you to have a successful crop in the long run. Now, what we're seeing coming out of prohibition, coming out of using domes and propagation on small scale is high success. But when that goes into the greenhouse, there's not always a translation of success when using larger scale equipment, misting, greenhouses, no dome, small, extreme controlled conditions. We see propagators having low success and having a lot of failure, which leads them to sticking on average about 20% extra, meaning you need 20% extra mother stock, 20% extra cuttings, a lot of death, a lot of wasted media, and a lot of wasted time and labor. This needs fixed. This needs focused on. So between general problems of immediately taking cuttings and sticking them at your facility, there's also the idea of shipping nationally. Before we didn't really consider this as a possibility, but under DEA guidance, there are many, many hemp farmers who are propagating, selling, and shipping cuttings of cannabis, marijuana, across the nation. Of course, of hemp as well, but point being, it's just a really big growing activity. We have companies contacting us that are spending way too much on packaging and still having failure in shipping. So we thought we would take our skills and experience shipping unrooted cuttings of floriculture crops and apply it to this crop. The other thing that we're seeing a big need for is taking cuttings and holding them for later. So you send your crew out, you take thousands of cuttings, put them in the cooler, and then you're able to stick them for the remaining days of the week. You're not in a rush. You've took all your cuttings at one time, so your mother stock is all at the same stage, and you're good to go for the next week. But again, there have been a lot of reported problems for holding this long. So we are ready to jump in and make a best practices for propagation unrooted cuttings. Okay, so what we'll be talking about is really dual purpose relevancy for shipping and holding. We need to look at the gases and understand them, understand how to manipulate. We need to understand time and how it is or is not on our side, whether it's putting it in a cooler or whether it's overnighting cuttings. Well, what happens if, as always, the mail messes up and it's in a box for 3 days? Are they going to survive? Whose fault is it and who has to pay for that? Big problems, and this will just get bigger as we have federal legalization. Now, packaging. I have seen clients, growers, spend hundreds of dollars to ship 100 cuttings, just on the packaging, not even including shipping costs. Go way over extravagant and have lights in the boxes, and you're sitting in a Yeti cooler. Just ridiculous methods, because there's not been a look back at how this is already done with other crops. Temperature. Do you want ice packs? Do you want heat packs? Where should they be in the box? Should they be touching the plant? All things that are extremely important and needs to be paid attention to. Humidity. Of course you need humidity, but if we're trying to get rid of some of these gases, maybe that has to be altered in order to release the humidity. Again, lights. We know if there's not lights, short days equates to flowering. Well, how many days, how many hours of no light until you start to get some sort of flower initiation? That is a problem. The clone shipper there on the right, these work well. They They do the job, but if you're a commercial producer and you're shipping thousands and thousands, paying $20 for something like this is insanity. It's not reality. So getting down to performing and acting more of the floriculture industry is where our mind should be. So if you look in the middle, this is how we send our CBD varieties. Works perfectly. Bag science is a thing. Understanding how much or how big holes should be according to the volume of plant material you have. So many things to think about in order to be successful. First, we're going to focus on gas, ethylene. You've all heard of it. It's a hydrocarbon gas that's colorless and actually quite flammable. It produces a sweet and musky odor when it's in its pure form. It is one of the most studied plant hormones. It is studied for various aspects within horticulture, everything from fruiting, flowering, rooting, etc. Let's dig into this a little more. All right, so to understand ethylene's role and how it affects the cannabis plant, it's important to look back into other plants and see how ethylene affects those stages. So first being ripening. Of course, banana ripens, ethylene ripens bananas. It triggers the ripening process by breaking down cell walls and converting starches to sugars. So think about this. Green bananas, very different flavor, texture than ripe bananas. That's all about the starch to sugar conversions and due to ethylene influence. Senescence, ethylene regulates the senescence of the plant tissues, flowers. It promotes breakdown of chlorophyll and other pigments. So that makes you think, okay, are we actually breaking down chlorophyll in post-harvest? And how was that influenced by ethylene? Fruit incision. A lot of fruit trees, if there's a lot of little fruits and you want less but bigger fruits, there are products where you can spray ethylene on these trees and it actually causes the fruit to abscise, fall off. And so you then have less fruit but bigger fruit. Root growth. This is an interesting one. There are many plants where ethylene will inhibit rooting, but there's also some where it promotes it. We don't know what happens in cannabis. We need to understand. Stress responses, of course, everything from pathogen attacks to flooding, drought. Ethylene helps cope with some of these stresses by coordinating adaptive responses, closing stomata. Ethylene has a role in just about everything that happens in this plant. Abiotic stresses, developmental processes, so seed germination, helping form certain root structures, etc., etc. So I think it's pretty obvious that ethylene in general has a huge role in plants, but now it's our job to figure out how we can either take away or give more ethylene to do what we want it to do. So there is a product already out there, many of you I'm sure know, 1-MCP. So it's a synthetic compound that's widely used in agriculture and post-harvest to extend shelf life and improve quality. Every time I've ever sent an ornamental cutting, one of these packets go into the box. There's lots of varieties, poinsettia, for example, where ethylene, it won't delay rooting, but it will cause all the leaves to fall off. So controlling ethylene is an important concept, specifically looking at shipping unrooted cuttings. Again, asterisks, 1-MCT can also cause a delay in rooting or even inhibition for certain species. Now, again, not enough has been done with cannabis to know which way this tool goes, whether it can cause more problems or actually alleviate problems. But it is a tool we have in our tool bag and that we need to understand greater. All right, so I want to go back to the basics because I'm going to show you some results from some experiments we've done recently. And I just want to make sure you're wrapping your head around the full concept because we did get some surprising results. All right, so we've got photosynthesis, brings in water, brings in sunlight, brings in CO2, and produces O2 and glucose. Now, it's not like humans where we breathe in and breathe out, and you're having that immediate exchange. Really, what happens as far as energy formation is in the dark cycle, or when cellular respiration happens. The O2 and the glucose that may come out of the photosynthesis process is then used, and then carbon dioxide is made. So I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind that yes, even though plants do take in CO2 and let out O2 in the most general concept, it will actually make CO2 as well. And understanding why that formation is happening versus CO2 uptake is important. So we'll come back to this, but just want to make sure you had that in the back of your head. All right, so here is our Felix gas analyzer and a jar of sealed cuttings. So there are 20 cuttings in here, unrooted, and it's just a wet napkin, squeezed enough to where if you squeezed it again, it would not leak any water. So it's just damp. Bottoms are wrapped just to keep the turgidity, and then we measure gas evolution over time. Actually, I'm going to go back a second. So being out of ornamentals for 15 years now or so, I had to stop and think, all right, well, what should happen? Well, you have a plant, you put it in a container, and if it breathes CO2, what would you expect? Well, that the CO2 goes down over time, right? Well, that's not what happened. So granted, this data is literally backed up to today, because it was in the shop. It was being, our equipment was being fixed. So I didn't get as far along with this project as I wanted to enable to show you today. But I think even just data to this point is very interesting. All right, so we've got O2 on the left axis, and CO2 and ethylene on the right, and this is the last 5 days. So you would think, all right, well, it's going to continue to photosynthesize because it's in the light, and it's going to use up the CO2. Well, guess what? CO2 is actually skyrocketing. And so you think, all right, well, maybe we do not have active photosynthesis here, but what do we have? We have respiration. And so as time goes by, these plants have been cut. The plants think they are dead and or dying. So they're using up all their internal resources. They're respiring. And so they're making energy to survive instead of making new energy to grow. And so it makes sense. We see an extreme rise in CO2 and a drop in O2, and then interesting, ethylene stays steady but is continually going down. Now, I'm super excited to see what happens once the plant begins to callus, once it begins to throw out roots, once it is completely rooted. What happens? Where is that transition point of stopping respiration and thinking, oh crap, I'm calloused, I'm actually going to survive, and I better start bringing in more light to keep myself going. So I'll show that at another date, but what I would like to think happens is CO2 accumulation stops, and it starts to make use of all that CO2 it's actually been forming. Now, ethylene, you can see ethylene is, I wouldn't call it high, but it is there. It stays pretty static, and I believe after a while it will also decrease. Now, where the interesting interaction and where more testing needs to happen is understanding if you had your cuttings at a lower temperature, meaning less respiration, just less metabolic function in general, would ethylene be produced as much? So, repeating this at different temperatures, I think, will be very interesting and tell us a lot about what's going on. Okay, so you may say, great, 2 ppm ethylene, but I need some sort of tool here for measurement. And so I threw these out because I thought it was interesting. At the same time I was doing this project, I took the same size jar and put about a third of a banana inside of the jar. It was overripe banana as well. Let it sit there for an hour, and when I measured it, it was about 50 parts per million ethylene. Now, Lantana looked at a study with it, and it is considered detrimental at 2 ppm ethylene. So even at those low numbers, there's still work, still efforts, reasoning for using 1 MCP packets to stop even just a low number of 2. That really being the gold standard of being under 1%. Now, with my monitor, its range gets fuzzy within 1 ppm. So I'm going to be reaching out to them to see, all right, well, are there versions of your equipment where the range isn't 1 to 1,000 ppm, it's 0 to 5 ppm, where you can get a little bit more accuracy on those lower concentrations. Okay, so as we form these best practices, we gotta borrow from other crops. There's no sense to recreate the wheel. All right, so understanding gases and how to manipulate for optimization. We understand there's respiration going on at least for the first 5 days as a stored unrooted cutting at room temperature. Forgot to mention that's important, at room temperature, and I did have it under actually in and out of light. It was reading the same numbers. So understanding how these accumulate and form, if it's at 50 degrees, if it's at 35 degrees, or if it's at 80 degrees, I think is very important. And then at those temperatures, what if we remove the ethylene? What if we use 1 MCP? Is that going to remove any negative effects, but then later decrease in rooting? Maybe. Got to figure it out. But here's something we can borrow from Dr. Faust and John Dole and papers they've put out with similar studies, but with lantana and other ornamental crops. Greatly appreciate having this as a backbone for studies in cannabis. This is looking at lantana, and so you see these treatments just had air, these had MCP, and then the ethylene rate applied at different rates. And you can see with the high ethylene treatment, there's definitely damage. Now, I've yet to see leaves fall off the same sort of way as they do in poinsettias, for example, but there can be other detrimental effects. And so, once we're able to just understand naturally what the cannabis plant does, then we can start looking at studies like this and say, okay, well, let's do these different treatments. Not only just do the treatments, but then see how those affect long-term rooting. Next, we need to optimize temperatures. And I don't mean of the mother stalk, and I don't mean in propagation. I mean in between. And so whether that's storage temperatures for shipment or storage temperatures for ease of the efficiency of your team, meaning storage in the cooler and pull out and stick throughout the week, we've got to know those specifics. Again, here is some examples from other ornamental crops done by Dr. Faust. First, looking at the effect of post-harvest temperature and duration on poinsettia cutting survival. So here we're looking at different storage durations, temperatures, and then success of rooting. Because just because it looks good coming out of the cooler does not necessarily mean it will then equate to rooting properly or efficiently or consistently. Next, looking at respiration rates at these different temperatures. So, thinking about how we can reduce respiration, because ultimately it's just, in lack of better words, it's just eating itself. It's just eating instead of continually bringing in photons to create more energy. So at some point, it will use all of its resources. And so we don't want that. Prohibiting death is prohibiting excessive respiration. And of course, it makes sense. Lower temperatures, less enzymatic reactions, less respiration happening. So storage temperature is crucial to understand. But of course, too cold, too hot, there can also be other negatives that come to play. Recovery. There are many times where you forget to turn on your mist. Maybe your package is delayed a week, but the temperatures were okay. Well, at this point, maybe you have really, really wilted plants, and you need to recover, and you need to recover fast. Well, I've played with these, and the cannabis plant is hardy. I mean, I have literally, and actually for this project I'm about to show you, put cuttings on top of a car in the heat of summer in order to get them as wilted as possible, to the point to where you would never believe they're coming back. Well, there are recovery steps for cuttings that look like they're long past gone. And usually that is done with a surfactant. Now I wanted to show you how the surfactant was being applied, and so it's a soak. But then also keep in mind that if you do not have the right concentration of surfactant, you can bring on other problems. And so this right here is water soaked marks from having too high a rate of surfactant, and that will not pop back. The plant will live depending on how intense this happens. But optimizing rates and duration for soaking is crucial. Now, we've gone through this a couple of times, but I would certainly like to do another couple times before I have a hard, solid guide for recovery. But I think this kind of gets your mind going of the situations and steps around optimizing for this process. So here we've got minutes, and so that would be minutes after put into a container and soaked, whether it was tap water or surfactant. All right, so these pictures are the same because right off the car they came, very wilted. It's the same plant. From there, they are put into their treatment. So 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and 30 minutes. Now, tap water did recover. I rated full recovery being at about 30 minutes. Whereas with a surfactant, you have recovery in 10 minutes. And so, though you can achieve a completely turgid rehydration on a cutting in 30 minutes, well, maybe you don't have 30 minutes to spare. Maybe your team needs to stick these right away and move on to the next job. Maybe that's a reason to start implementing surfactant practices into your propagation. Because like I said, within 10 minutes with this surfactant, they were turgid as day one and could be stuck and are ready to go. The other thing we want to follow up with on this study is there any sort of impact on rooting due to a surfactant? Now, because it makes sense, we'll also do, is there any impact on rooting due to the extreme wilting? So much to do, so little time, but I hope you can see the vision of where we're taking this and really optimizing the steps of taking cuttings from a mother plant and sticking them in all of the ways in between that the plant can change, be affected, produce gases. We can really wrap our heads around this quite easily by following the steps other floricultural professionals have took and implemented into their industry. So that's all for today, but I hope you see some really cool things coming down the line. I hope it busted your brain a little bit to see how much respiration is happening, not just day one, not day two, but for quite a few days within within propagation. It makes my mind go crazy to think, okay, well, if you're not photosynthesizing the first few days, could we just apply enough light to keep the plant awake? But you don't need that energy to feed the plants, let's say the first 5 days, because they're callousing and they're going to respire until callus formation happens. Just ways to think about using this data and implementing it into your commercial facility is the goal and what we're getting at. So anything else you can think of to add to this best understanding, best practices, I'd love to hear about them. But this is the bullet points right now and where we're headed with our research. I hope you found some value in it, and we'll see you next month.